It's time for us now to go into our third essential skill. This is the skill of breaking an opponent down to a hip. So often I see talented athletes try to get to a break in scenarios where it's just unlikely you're going to succeed. The most common mistake is where people try to get a heel hook break on people that are standing over them. Let's understand something. Take a seat. The optimal position for me to go to break someone is always when they're down on two hips, like so. This is the best breaking scenario. Okay? Of course, only a very naive person would say you're always going to be able to break someone down to two hips, but this is the preferred scenario. In competition, however, you'll often have opponents who turn up to a knee, and you may have to get breaks in positions like so, or they may even come up to a full standing position. Okay? As a general rule, I don't recommend trying to get breaking activity on people that are standing over you. Always what we want to do is first put our opponent down to a hip and then do our breaking from here. Or at the very least, when they're on one knee, some situation like so, but not when they're standing over us. So a natural question that arises is, how are we going to break a resisting opponent down to a hip and keep them on a hip or a knee long enough that we can get an effective break? That's the subject matter of this next section. We've seen that when it's time to exert breaking force with a heel hook on our opponent, the optimal time to do this is when we've broken our opponent down to a hip. As a general rule, heel hooks are difficult to finish on a standing opponent. So the general rule of thumb we work with is first put them on their hip, then go into your breaking sequences that we'll be looking at later in this instructional. We need to look now at one of the most commonly used and one of the most effective methods of breaking a standing opponent down to a hip so we can go in and attack the legs. This is the single leg Ashigarami knockdown. From a situation where I've successfully gotten hold of my training partner's leg in a fairly standard Urumi Ashigarami, our knees are pointing outwards. From here, we're going to take our hand and go through and grip our own buttocks, or alternatively, punch through and put a hand on our own stomach. They're both excellent options. Now, from this position, my inside foot is going to go to the straight buttock position. My right foot to my training partner's left buttock. That's a very important detail in the move that we're about to look at. Now, from here, with my knee and my ankle facing in the same direction, we're going to start with a force upwards. Why upwards? That's what loads weight onto my training partner's far heel. As the force goes up, we turn and my two knees are going to push in a curve over my training partner's thigh, so that initially weight goes onto the heels and then weight goes over the thigh and turns my opponent down and breaks him down to a hip. We're now in a perfect position to go into our leg lock sequences. Our opponent's on the hip on the floor, and we now have a high percentage chance of knocking our opponent down and finishing. Let's have a look at that from a different angle. From a situation where I start off in a good solid Urumi Ashigarami, I take the shoelaces of my inside foot and place it on the far buttock, the so-called straight buttock position. Now, from here I make sure that knee and ankle are touching. His knee is well within my knee line. I start not by pushing with my legs, but by pulling with my legs. As a result, my hips rise and it puts weight onto my training partner's heel and staggers him back. Now I turn everything over the thigh and knock my training partner down to the mat. This is a demonstration of the move on a largely unresisting opponent. In truth, you'll catch a lot of your less experienced opponents with this move and knock them down quite easily. But what about more experienced opponents? What about people who know how to position themselves to make it difficult to complete the move? Well, let's look at exactly what makes it difficult. From a situation where I have Placido's foot in a good Urumi Ashigarami, if he brings his head down towards my hand, now he's in a position where he can start hopping with his secondary leg. I have the primary leg locked inside my Ashigarami. Watch what he does with the secondary leg. As the head comes down to my right hand side, he can now engage in a hop with this foot here so that as I put pressure, he hops and doesn't fall. Even when I put substantial pressure, a good athlete will just keep his base and you can't put it down. Okay? What's gone wrong is that I'm not using the inside foot properly. If I put my inside foot, as most people do, on the same side, cross buttock position, I can't do anything to interfere with my opponent's secondary leg. And as a result, he can effortlessly hop with me. Head down, and I'll never get him over. What I need to do is to interfere with that hop that enables him to keep his balance. So I'm going to take that shoelace and put it here, high on the buttocks where the hamstring meets the buttocks. When I go into the Ashigarami and I put pressure on my training partner, what you're going to find is he can take 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 hops. But every time he hops, he will have less and less capacity to follow the movement of your legs over his thigh. And so you get a pattern like this. And down to the mat on the 3rd or 4th hop. And we get the breakdown. This kind of hopping approach is what we're looking for in high level competition. I'm going to demonstrate it with our backs to the camera so you can see my foot positioning. We go into the original Ashigarami. If I place my foot poorly and he brings the head down for balance, he can hop in an unlimited fashion. However, if I put my foot correctly in the straight Ashigarami position, now he can hop to a certain degree, but my foot interferes with his hopping ability, and as a result, we get a clean knockdown. As always, my head comes forward over my training partner's knee to ensure a tight connection as we hit the floor. Once we get our opponent's hips grounded to the mat, then we can get into the breaking game. We've been looking at the idea of breaking an opponent down to a hip. We know that the most high percentage way to approach the leg lock game is always to put your opponent's hips on the floor, and from there go about your breaking work. It's very difficult to get breaking pressure on people that are standing over you and fighting the Ashigarami. So the general rule of thumb that we work with is put them down first, put them on their hip, and then go into the breaking sequences. Now, we just looked at the single leg method of breaking someone down to a hip. Let's look at my personal favorite method of doing it, the double leg variation. In a situation where I have a standard or a Rumi Ashigarami locked in like so, from here there's always going to be that guy who brings his head into a good, strong defensive position and starts fighting your Ashigarami. What they're going to do is take a hand to your inside knee and a hand to your outside foot, and they're going to peel the Ashigarami apart. And from here there's a variety of defensive movements they can make. But it all starts with this peeling action. Inside knee, outside foot, and we start to lose the structure of the Ashigarami. Okay? Once he breaks foot and knee apart, gravity pulls me down and I lose the grip that I had. Whenever we see this going on, presumably he'll have this foot back and away from me in a good defensive stance. From here, as soon as I feel I'm losing, I'm going to switch from a straight buttock position to a cross buttock position. From cross buttock, I'm going to bump my training partner forward so his hands go towards the mat. At the same time, I'm going to reach across and score the second leg. Now from here, I can go in a variety of ways. One is simply to rethrow my legs right back where I came from and knock my training partner down to his hips. Another is to switch off to an Ashigarami on the other leg. I catch, fire my legs across, and from here I hit the single leg Ashigarami on the opposite leg. So once again, we start off in a fairly standard Arumi Ashigarami type situation. From here, my opponent breaks the structure of the lock, and I make a switch to a cross buttock position. I push off the floor and I extend my leg, and I get his weight going forward over my right shoulder. As a result, we're in the perfect position to either double leg, like so, come up, and then use the double leg position to knock my opponent down. What's so special about the double leg? Well, we know what the basic defensive movement is on his part. It's head down and hopping. If I'm holding the second leg, there's no hopping. He just goes straight down to the floor. Alternatively, once I get my opponent forward in this position, if I feel everything's too close for me to come up successfully into an Ashigarami on my opponent's right leg, then I will simply pommel my legs and switch my head across the body and come up to a single leg Ashi on the other side. These are both highly effective methods of knocking my opponent down to a hip so I can go back into the breaking sequences. One of my favorite ways to break people down to the mat is to use the obvious links between Ashigarami and various other forms of guard position, which also, like Ashigarami, rely on inside control. The single most important one, in my opinion, is X-guard. There is an absolutely critical link between Ashigarami as a form of guard and X-guard. Whenever you have one, you always have the other. There is another form of guard which it actually encompasses many different kinds of guard, but they all have one thing in common. My shins are inside my opponent's legs. Any variety of guard where my shins are inside my opponent's legs, let's categorize that as just a general shin guard. Okay. Anytime I have X guard, anytime I have any variety of shin guard, I can knock my opponent down. I can use those guards as a mechanism of sweeping my opponent, and because my legs are in the inside position, I can immediately transfer to a form of Ashigarami the moment we hit the ground. This is one of the absolute most effective ways of breaking someone down to a hip and then going directly into our leg attacks. So let's look at some simple examples. From any situation where I'm working with a standing opponent over me, I can use any generic form of entry into the legs. Let's say, for example, I go into a basic Arimi Ashigarami, and from here I make a transfer into X-guard. Okay. The moment we get into X-guard, we can start breaking our opponent down to a hip. Okay. Let's look at some common sense examples from here. One very obvious one is the tension between off-balancing my opponent forwards and off-balancing my training partner backwards. Okay. In one, my knees tilt to my right-hand side, and that brings my opponent's hands to the floor. In the other, I drop a foot and tilt my knees to the left-hand side, and I break him backwards to a hip. The moment my opponent gets broken down to a hip in this direction, it's very easy for me to start entering into the legs. Okay? A simple transition which I greatly favor here is to pommel my foot to the inside position, and then from here I sit up and forward up to my training partner's knee with my head. Then from here I push off my right foot, place my hand across the floor on the other side, and as a result we can simply dive roll on our training partner's legs and find ourselves in a cross Ashigarami position on the other side. Once again, from any generic situation where I start off with Arimi or standard Ashigarami, we make the transfer into X-guard. From here, we can off-balance a man forward onto his hands by rotating our knees this way. I can drop my opponent in the opposite direction as he reacts to that by putting a foot down and turning my knees in this direction. Now I pommel my foot to the inside position. I sit up so that my head goes over my training partner's knee. I push off my two legs, and as a result I'm able to post on the floor, slide my knee around the corner, and then from here I find myself in the perfect attacking position to go into inside heel hooks and various other forms of Ashigarami control. So this would be a simple example of using X-guard to put the man down to a hip and then go on the attack. Let's look at several other examples also taken out of X-guard. From a situation where, once again, we have the X-guard, I see his foot is some distance from me and hard for me to reach. No problem, I simply lift my training partner on my left knee and bring his foot in towards me. And as a result, we can easily access it. Now from here, it's a simple thing for us to push our training partner straight down to the mat and drop him to the floor. Now it's a simple thing for us to go into varieties of Ashigarami, to simply pommeling the legs. He's broken down to a hip, and we're ready to play the leg game. Once again, from any given X-guard situation, not a difficult thing for us to start bringing the foot in towards us. I bring my knees to my chest, extend my right leg, and as a result the foot comes in very easily to my hand. Now from here we drive and put our training partner down to a hip. Simply pulling on the leg gives us the perfect Ashigarami position, ready to go. There are myriad ways to knock someone down from X-guard. Anything that ends with my opponent down on a hip will immediately, because you already have inside position courtesy of X-guard, enable you to pommel straight away into the Ashigarami you're looking for. Alternatively, shin guard. From a situation where I have any kind of inside position with my feet. Doesn't matter whether it's Ashigarami, X-guard, or what have you. Okay? Any situation like so, it's not a difficult thing for me to bring my hand across and pull my second leg in so that my two shins are inside my training partner's knees. Now, no matter how strong he makes his base, he can grab my head, he can do all those things that people like to do to defend themselves. All I have to do is lift my training partner's body off the mat and drop my training partner down to the floor. As a result, we can easily put our opponent into a form of Ashigarami. Other varieties of shin guard, so simple for us in situations where we're locked a scoop grip on our training partner. It's not a difficult thing to bring 2 feet underneath our training partner's hamstring, and then right from here we can punch our training partner straight down to the floor. And from here we have Ashigarami on either side. Anytime we have shins inside our training partner's legs or the X-guard position, any sweep you know from those situations that puts your opponent down to a hip will give you Ashigarami for one simple reason. Your legs are already in the inside position. If I have shin guard, if I have X guard, you're already there. You already have inside position. Anytime you knock someone down to a hip from that position, you'll be ready to start the leg lock game with them broken down into a favorable hip on the floor position. We've been looking at the idea of breaking an opponent down to a hip. We know that when someone's on a hip, that's the favorable position to be breaking people. You can break people in other positions, but the percentages start going down. A specific situation that often occurs in competition with our athletes, both in the gym and in competition, is from a cross Ashigarami position, where we have our training partner's leg controlled like so, and from here, as will be seen later in this instructional series, one of our favorite gambits from this position is to control both of our training partner's legs. Ultimately, I want to perform an inside heel hook on what we call the primary leg. Okay? Your opponents know that, and very often they will do everything they can to start turning away and getting their hips off the floor. So they will start putting their body up in positions like so, and from here you're going to have to bet them back down towards the mat. Their hips are no longer on the floor. If I try to go into a break in a position like this, it's going to be very, very low percentage indeed. Okay? So the question is, how am I going to break someone down to a hip in situations like this? Well, the most important thing is to understand directionality of force. If I just push into my opponent's hands, particularly if Placido moves his head in this direction, I'm pushing into his hands, and it's very difficult for me to get a satisfactory force on my opponent. So what I want to do is retain my grip on the secondary leg and start pushing not into the line of my training partner's spine, but across the line of my opponent's spine, particularly at the hips. I can do this in numerous ways. Okay? Here, as I hold on to my training partner, I'm going to exert a force across my training partner's hips by posting on the floor and turning my knee outwards against my training partner's hips. It quickly puts his hand back down to the mat. So every time I see him cross over the center line, I post on the floor just like so. Now, pushing off the floor and sliding my knees underneath, I open my knee against his hips. He's trying to rotate in this direction, and I rotate him right back. Okay? If I feel my opponent is so strong in this position that I cannot rotate him back, then it becomes permissible for me to rotate across in the opposite position and roll through on my training partner. If he goes to turn in this direction here, I will follow, turn across his body, and roll him through to return him back to the mat. Okay? So by exerting forces across the hips instead of in line with the spine, we can often get people back down to the floor, broken down to a hip, where we can start the process of going in to get our breaks. We go now to our fourth essential skill of the Ashigarami and heel hooking game. This is the skill of exposing your opponent's heel. This is such an important skill. I'll tell you now, if you cannot reliably and systematically expose your opponent's heel, you can have all the other skills of heel hooking highly developed and you'll never heel hook anybody. Your ability to get into a strong heel hook finish is entirely contingent upon your ability to expose your opponent's heel and get it locked underneath your wrist. Any skill and proficiency you have in the other areas of the game will be completely undermined by lack of skill in this critical area. So let's understand what is heal exposure, have a clear understanding of what we're trying to do, what we're trying to achieve, and then look at some concrete methods of actually achieving it. We have to be able to expose our opponent's heal in both straight Ashigarami situations and cross Ashigarami situations. Let's start with straight Ashigarami, okay? That's a good place for us to begin. Let's understand something. If my opponent's heel is on the floor, there's no heel hooking on my part. The first requirement that I need in any kind of heel exposure is elevation. His foot, in particular the heel, must be off the mat. Again, if the heel is planted firmly on the mat, I simply can't get through to any form of heel hook. The good news is there's some pretty robust methods of getting a heel off the mat. The second element is the soles of my training partner's feet. He always wants his shoelaces facing away from me and the sole of his feet pressing into me. When he combines this with the heel on the mat, it becomes extremely difficult for me to expose my opponent's heel. And as a result, the whole heel hooking game can be shut down just by my opponent putting his ankle in this good, robust, and safe position. What I need as the attacking athlete is to be able to systematically work my opponent's heel off the mat and turned outwards. Only then can I get what I need, which is my opponent's heel on top of my wrist, just like so. There is often a strong battle fought at the higher levels to get this heel exposure. Your opponent will soon learn and understand that hiding his heel from you is everything in this defensive aspect of the game. So what we need is this ability to first get our opponent's heel off the mat and then preferably turn it outwards to expose the heel to our wrist and get into a winning situation. We're going to look now at the first concrete method of generating heel exposure. This is the one used probably most often by my students in competition. It works well at all levels, all the way up to the highest levels of the sport. It's actually just an extrapolation of a very broad method of gripping that we use all the time in the sport of jiu-jitsu and many other forms of grappling. This is the so-called idea of a feeding grip, where one grip feeds to another. Okay, in order to make a stronger or more effective grip. So for example, if we were working with a gi in the standing position, let's say so, if I want a lapel grip on my training partner, it's not always easy just to go straight in and get a lapel grip. You often find the lapel grip is unsatisfactory in some way. You wanted a strong, robust grip, and if you just snatch the grip, it's often of mediocre quality. So very often, a method of gripping which is used is a 2-on-1 lapel feed, where I go in on my training partner with a cross grip, and I open and expose my opponent's lapel to my second grip. And as a result, when I fix up the grip, I now have a much better form of grip on my training partner, which will facilitate movement and control around the mat. Okay, so this is a simple idea which we use all the time in the sport of jiu-jitsu with a jacket on, the idea of a 2-on-1 lapel feed, where I expose a lapel, and as a result, it's much better for me to fit my grip in and exert considerable control on my training partner in ways that will set up movement on the feet. Okay, we use the same principle when we go to heel hook. In a straight Ashigarami type situation, where my opponent does a good job of keeping his foot and heel flat to the mat, just like so, okay, we will often make use of a lifting method, where essentially I take what I know I need, my opponent's shoelaces in my bicep, and I physically lift my opponent's foot into the preferred grip. So my left hand feeds the grip of my right hand, my right arm. Ultimately, my right arm is going to be the grip for the heel hook, but it's the left hand that feeds it in and gives me what I want. Okay, so essentially it's the same principle we saw with the jacket applied to leg locking. Lifting, either using a hand grip or a wrist grip, and then from here I lift the heel physically off the mat so that I can enter with my wrist, and now we're ready to go. That's the basic idea behind the lifting method. Now let's look at some subtle and extremely important details. When my opponent's foot is on the mat, a very useful line of demarcation is the knuckle line of my training partner's toes. When I go to enter into the heel hook, I physically place my elbow directly on that line. Once again, there's the knuckle line of my training partner's toes. I place my elbow directly on that line. The first thing I do is I line up my forearm with his foot. That's going to make for an excellent feed into the heel hook. If my elbow is poorly placed, now I have to move my training partner's foot a long way into the heel hook, and in that time my opponent can slip his toes to the outside, etc., and you can end up with nothing. Okay, so the first thing we do is we position our elbow properly, and then we position our forearm properly. This minimizes the distance that my opponent's foot has to move to get into the correct position. Now I use either a palm lift or a wrist lift, and from here I keep my head over the foot, and we simply lift the heel over the hurdle of our forearm. And as a result, we're in perfect lock. Now, here's one of the most common mistakes I see. So often you'll see people do a good job of lifting, but then a very poor job immediately after that. The mistake they so often make is they line their forearm with their opponent's lower leg. That makes it very easy for Placido to point his toes and slip his heel back inside. And I've got to repeat the whole process again. This problem of heel slippage permeates throughout the leg lock game, and it's something you must learn to confront and overcome. Once again, first I need to minimize the distance traveled. I do that with elbow and forearm positioning. I bring my head over the top so there's weight on the leg, there's minimal space for him to move, and from here I go either wrist in or palm in. When I make the lift, I focus on getting my wrist underneath my training partner's heel, and then the critical detail. My forearm must line up with his foot, not his shin. Again, if I line up with the shin, heel slippage is always going to be a problem. So to prevent heel slippage, I take my forearm and line up with the foot. Now, this compresses his shoelaces to my ribs. Placido will tell you the moment I do this, there's tension in the leg. There's almost no tension here, easy for him to move his foot around. There's considerable tension here. Now, when he goes to slip the heel, it's well nigh impossible. And when we go to connect our hands, we'll have an immediate effect upon our opponent. Once again, first, minimizing distance. Elbow position, forearm position. Then the lift, using either the palm or the wrist, that gets the heel exposed. Once the heel's exposed, I've got to keep it exposed. It's no good having my opponent slip the heel by pointing the toes and going back inside. Once we've exposed the heel, we keep it exposed by rotating the elbow back. Now when my hands connect, we're in the perfect position to go on the attack and continue. It's important to understand that the lifting method works not only in the case of straight Ashigarami, but is also highly effective in cross Ashigarami situations. Conceptually, it's the simplest and easiest to understand of the various methods of exposing the heel. It's probably also the one we use the most in competition. Again, we know what the problem is. If our opponent's heel is jammed down to the floor, there's simply no heel exposure. I can't begin the heel hook process. Even worse, in situations where my opponent points the sole of his foot in towards me, in these situations, heel exposure becomes even tougher. Okay? As before, we always want the concept of the knuckle line of the toes. That's where we place our elbow. As before, we always want our forearm lined up with our training partner, right there at the foot. As a result, it's pretty simple for us to get a hand on our training partner's lower leg and make a simple lift that takes his heel higher than our wrist. Always remember, whenever you use the lifting method, the height required is always the height of your wrist. You have to be able to lift your opponent's heel higher than the wrist. If you can do this, you can heel hook them almost every time. elbow position, forearm position, and a lift that takes my opponent's heel higher than the wrist. Once that occurs, as always, from here, the initial danger is always heel slippage. If my opponent points his toes, he can slip the heel inside. So we always want to make sure we take our forearm and line our forearm up with our training partner's foot. Now when he goes to heel slip, it's very, very difficult indeed. And as a result, when the hands lock, we're in the perfect breaking position. Once again, we have an opponent who's doing a good job of keeping the heel down on the floor. We want to get a block at the line of the knuckles of the toes, good forearm position, and a lift that takes our training partner's heel over the barrier of the forearm. That's the height we need for the lift. Once we're there, we have to sweep back with the elbow to get ourselves in a strong breaking position. When he goes to slip the heel now, it's well nigh impossible. And from here, we get very strong breaks. We're looking at the critical notion of heel exposure. We've seen that without heel exposure, there's no heel hook game. We have to be able to expose our opponent's heel, get our wrist underneath, and from there, we can start the ball rolling. Let's look now at another excellent method of exposing my opponent's heel, which is particularly important in any straight ashigarami situation. We know that at a minimum, our opponent has to keep his heel on the floor. If he just does that, lifting methods work exceptionally well to expose the heel. However, some of your opponents will not only put the heel on the floor, they'll point the sole of the foot inwards towards you, so that now it's a very difficult thing to even lift successfully and get to the heel. In these situations, I often recommend the center line method. From here, I'm going to start with a classic or a rimi ashigarami. I'm going to put my foot on my training partner's hip and I'm going to shift my hips outwards. My whole effort is to turn my knees across my training partner's center line. When I do this, look how a simple shift of my hips lifts my training partner's heel off the mat and turns his heel in an outwards direction. I can cement that in place by passing my foot across the center line like so. Even as my opponent tries to return his foot back where it came from, it's so difficult now. And as a result, it's very easy for us to lock in and get our wrist underneath in the preferred position with our forearm lined up with our training partner's foot and into a win. Once again, from a situation where my opponent is doing an excellent job of putting his heel dug in tight to my hip, his heel on the floor, and the sole of his foot turned in towards me. It's a very difficult thing for me now to get underneath and try and dig for my opponent's heel. So instead, we put our foot on our training partner's hip and we shrimp our body outwards and turn our knees from facing east to facing west. And as a result, we quickly get the heel exposure we're looking for. Now, heel exposure doesn't last long. When it's there, take advantage. Get the wrist underneath. Solidify it by passing the foot across the center line, and now we're in business. We're looking at one of the critical skills of heel hooking, exposing the heel. We've looked at a range of methods to expose the heel. Let's look now at one of my favorites. From any cross ashigarami situation, there's always a problem when people put the heel turned down like so, heel on the floor, sole of the foot pointing back towards me. Now it's very, very tough for me to expose my opponent's heel. In situations like this, I will often use a tilt to get my opponent's heel exposed. I start by taking my hand and going wrist deep around my training partner's knee. I position my elbow just inside the knuckles of the toe line, and then from here I pass my foot through underneath my training partner's knee just like so. Then I create a drive leg, placing the sole of my foot close to my training partner's crotch, and I tilt back against his direction. He wants to tilt in this direction. That's what protects his heel. So I bring my hips underneath him, and then from here I lift and tilt my training partner across to the other side. And as a result, we end up with an exposed heel ready to attack. Once again, from a situation where my opponent is doing a good job of hiding his heel, we go through and lock up, placing elbow and hand in place. I bring my foot in as a drive leg and hook my training partner's far leg. As a result, I can lift and tilt my training partner over, exposing his heel in the usual fashion, and as a result, when we come back in the opposite direction, we find ourselves in a superb braking position, ready to go. Again, we have our training partner in the cross Ashigarami position. From here, he's doing a good job of turning away in the direction that hides his heel. I cover my training partner's toe line, I hook a hold of my training partner's far leg, I plant my drive leg in place, and even as he braces his body against me, we get a good opportunity now to lift him back in the direction we wanted and expose his heel. From here, we lock the figure of 4 so that as we come back in the direction he favors for his escape, he finds himself unable to break the lock and we're in a winning position. We've been looking at the skill of leg locking out of Ashigarami as a game built around 6 essential skills. We're going to start now with the 5th of those essential skills. In my opinion, in combat and competitive situations, this is the single most important skill you'll need to develop. This is the skill of negating your opponent's resistance as you go in for the various locks that you wish to employ. In top-level competition, your ability to negate the expected lines of resistance is probably the single most common or most important factor in determining winner and loser. I'm going to show you some rather basic elements of negating resistance in this particular section. However, when we go into the 3 main manifestations of the leg lock system, I will come back to this topic in great detail. Most of my attention to this topic, negating resistance, will come at a later stage in the instructional, but I wanted to give you just a quick introduction to the idea and some concrete methods of negating early resistance when we work out of Ashigarami. Let's look first at very common lines of resistance when we've first gone into our training partner's legs and our opponent is trying to break away from an Orimi Ashigarami. Some of the most common forms of resistance that we see are an intelligent attempt to separate my knee and my ankle. When my opponent succeeds in doing this, he opens a gateway for his body to go out over my Ashigarami and into an escape. Once again, my opponent knows that I want to close the circle around his leg and hip. It's very much in his interest to open that circle. He does it with a combination of pulling on my knee, pushing on the foot, and separating my 2 feet. Once that occurs, it's pretty easy for him to start hopping over the Ashigarami itself, and from here, he's gone. What should I be looking to do when this occurs? Well, one of our favorite methods of dealing with this is pommeling and switching legs. As I see, I lose the Ashigarami on my training partner's left leg. My opponent hops across. He will offer me opportunities to switch into the second leg, and as a result, we can go back into an Ashigarami on the opposite foot. Now, my training partner goes off. Even as I see I'm losing the Ashigarami, I hold this leg here. And as a result, I can pommel through, switch direction, and lock. It's very important I time the use of my opposite hand. Here, you can clearly see I'm about to lose the Ashigarami on my training partner's left leg. Even as I lose it, I'm already thinking about catching the second leg, pommeling through, and finding myself in the perfect attacking position on the opposite side. Again, my opponent goes into the escape. Already, I catch right there at the knee, so that even as he performs one escape, I perform one entry, and we get the lock. Now, let's extend this idea further. Currently, I've been working with my knees pointing to the outside, and as I make the switch, once again, my knees point to the outside. This time, we're going to perform with our knees pointing to the outside in one direction. I lose the Ashigarami, but instead of pointing my knees to the outside on the second leg, we're going to stay with our legs pointing to the inside in the same direction they were. As a result, I can pass my feet across and immediately start going into a heel hook attack and going into another form of Ashigarami that we'll see later on in the instructional series, the outside Ashigarami. Once again, shooting in this direction. My Ashigarami currently points in this direction. That's the direction shown by the knees. I lose an Arumi Ashigarami as my opponent goes over the top. I make a switch into an inside Ashigarami. As a result, as my opponent goes into a defensive roll, we come across into an outside Ashigarami and a win on the opposite side. In this way, we can pommel our legs into winning positions even as we're encountering resistance. Let's expand on this theme even further. This time, as I lose an Arumi Ashigarami on my training partner's left leg, I'm going to catch, pommel through, and lock an outside Ashigarami on the opposite leg. So I didn't go from Arumi to Arumi, I went from Arumi to outside. And as a result, we're in the perfect position to apply braking pressure on our training partner right where he is. Once again, I have an Arumi Ashigarami on my training partner's left leg. My opponent intelligently defends it. As he goes over the top, I bring my body in and I pass my inside leg over the top, and as a result, we sit back into a winning position, the outside Ashigarami on the opposite leg. This would be a second example of working from one Ashigarami to another as we encounter resistance. Let's look at another form of common resistance to the Arumi Ashigarami, my opponent coming forward and stacking me. From a situation where I have an Arumi Ashigarami on my training partner, very often my opponent will go to change levels and come up on top of me. That's an intelligent option on his part because it puts the sole of his foot on the floor and prevents me from getting heel exposure. As I see, I've lost the Ashigarami here because my opponent intelligently separates foot and knee. I'm going to place my right foot on my training partner's right buttock. As a result, I'm able to bump him forward and bring his hands towards the mat. The moment that occurs, we put in a cross frame, we take our free leg, kick through, lift our training partner's hips overhead, and we drop them into a very different form of Ashigarami, the cross Ashigarami. Let's start putting some of these concepts together. We've seen that from an initial start, where we have a standard or a Arumi Ashigarami, my opponent always looks to separate my two legs, the inside leg and the outside leg, and form an avenue of escape. So here I have the outside leg, inside leg, my opponent separates them and intelligently moves over the top. We saw a first line of resistance is to pommel in to an Arumi Ashigarami in the opposite direction. And as I see my opponent escaping, I'm already catching the second leg, pommeling my legs through and going side to side. We saw an extrapolation of this as my opponent intelligently goes over and separates inside and outside leg. Another option is for me to hit a second Arumi Ashigarami, bring my foot across the center line, turn it into an inside Ashigarami, then pressure, gets my training partner rolling, and culminates in an outside Ashigarami for the break. From there, we saw the notion of going from a failed Arumi Ashigarami, my opponent goes over the top, and we pommel directly through into an outside Ashigarami on the opposite leg. From there, we saw the idea of level changing. My opponent can not only go out and over a leg, my opponent can also, in these situations, come up forward. And when he does so, he prevents any kind of heel exposure. And now, when he fights off the Ashigarami, I can potentially be in trouble here. We saw the notion of using a cross buttock position to extend my opponent's weight over my outside shoulder. And then from here, we form a cross frame. Our secondary leg comes in, locks, brings his hips open over our head, and creates a catch where we can go into an even stronger attacking position that we'll be looking at later in the instructional series. These are some simple insights at the introductory level to dealing with common lines of resistance. We're going to be coming back to this topic, negating resistance, in much greater detail further into the instructional series as we look at the specific situations in which we actually do our braking. But this is a nice way to understand the first lines of resistance that occur at the level of an Arumi Ashigarami and how we deal with them. It's time for us now to enter the sixth and final of our sequential skills in the leg lock system. This is the skill of braking. Essentially, it's the study of mechanics, in particular, braking mechanics. I've always been proud of the fact that all of my students are breakers. If they can get to a finishing position all of them are capable of imparting tremendous braking force upon their opponents. This is an absolute necessity at championship level fighting and grappling. You have to be able to create a viable threat of breaking your opponent's legs in order to get a tap to win gold medal championship levels in open competition. It's as simple as that. So many times I see talented athletes who excel in getting to a leg, rolling around, moving with a leg, but when it's time to enact the break, the results are often anemic and underpowered. This cannot be the case. You have to be someone who poses a significant threat to your opponent. They have to understand that if they should get into a bad position, there's dire consequences. It's crucial then that you develop the skill, the dark arts as we call them, of breaking. I have an extended theory, a general theory of breaking, which I want to outline to you now. It's time for us now to go into the general theory of breaking mechanics. There are three critical elements behind the first presentation I'll give you of breaking mechanics. I'll demonstrate it from a straight ashigarami position, but soon we'll demonstrate exactly the same elements in a cross ashigarami situation also. The first element that we're going to look at when it comes time to breaking is the idea of contrary forces, or as they're often referred to, coupled forces. Tearing someone's ligaments is rather like tearing paper or cloth. If I want to tear a piece of cloth, I hold it and I exert a force in opposing directions. If I try to exert the same forces in the same direction, the cloth simply doesn't tear. We must have forces going in polar opposite directions, and then we get extremely strong tearing and breaking forces. So too with breaking ligaments. When I go to work on my training partner's legs, there are two elements where I have to apply contrary or coupled forces. One is on my opponent's ankle, and the other is upon my opponent's knee. Let's understand the ankle element first. I want to work at the ends of the lever, so it's very important I take the extreme end of my opponent's foot, the knuckle line of the toes, and place it right here in my bicep, just like so. I want, more than anything, to have a pushing force on the toes and a pulling force upon the heel. This is absolutely critical. All too often, what I see is people take the toes into a disadvantageous position up here in the armpit. Then they apply a singular force across the chest, a pulling force with no prerequisite push. And as a result, your opponent can simply turn in the same direction as that single force and escape. We can never have this. Always, I must start with a push on the toes and finish with a pull on the heel. The way we do this is we make sure the toes are put into a situation where my arm can exert a sufficient pushing force. Once I get my training partner's heel set, the first element that I want to work with is my elbow position. I want my elbow to come back into my body. The further my elbow is away from my body, the weaker my heel hook will become, and the weaker that critical initial pushing force will be. So we make sure we pull the elbow back into the body, just like so. You can see what's happening here. The more my opponent's foot points down the line of my body, the less effective my heel hook is. The more my training partner's foot points across the line of my body, I'm going to be far more effective in these cases. So, from here, when we lock up, watch my elbow position. The elbow comes back. That immediately creates a pushing force on my training partner's toes. Once we get a lock in here, the second element we want to work with is a pulling force that pulls my opponent's heel up off the mat. I ensure that the pushing force is strong by taking my body into a straight line. The more bent my body, the more anemic my heel hook will be. So we make sure that our head lines up. like so. As a result, we're maximizing the pushing force on the toes. Then from here, when we combine this with a pull on the heel, we quickly get tremendous braking pressure. Once again, there's a lift that puts my opponent's toes at the end of the lever, right there in the pocket of my elbow. Now, we start by taking our elbow back in tight towards our own body. From this position, it's a simple thing for us to take our head in line with our training partner's lower leg, and then from this position, even a small lift on my training partner's heel, and will generate powerful braking forces in minimal distance. This is the first element in this idea of contrary forces down there at the heel. Now, it doesn't finish there. We also need a set of contrary forces here at the knee. I'm going to take a little pressure off the ankle here because the two forces combined, it's very difficult for your training partner to work with. In addition to a specific rotation between a pull on the heel and a push on the toes at the foot, we also need a general sense of my opponent's ankle being turned across my chest while my knees push his knee in the opposite direction. All too often I see people exerting the force of their ashigarami in the same direction as the pull on the heel, which actually facilitates my training partner's escape. We don't want that. What we're looking for is to create situations where my ashigarami pushes inwards in the exact opposite direction of my heel hook. It's critical that we learn to distinguish between the mechanism of control, the ashigarami, and the mechanism of braking, the heel hook. You can always tell what is the force or what is the direction of force in any ashigarami by one telltale sign: the direction of your knees. I can look across a room and tell which direction the force of an ashigarami is being applied merely by looking at the athlete's knees. If my knees point out in this direction, that means the force of the ashigarami is going in that direction. If I have a heel hook which is going west and my knees are also going west, we have an unhappy result, which is the mechanism of braking is going in the same direction as the mechanism of control, and as a result my opponent can easily turn and start the action of slipping out. We want the exact opposite. If my heel hook is going to the west, I want my ashigarami going to the east. You'll notice my knees point out in this direction, but my heel hook is going in the exact opposite direction. As a result, when my opponent tries to alleviate force in this situation, he's going directly into the ashigarami. Now, instead of pulling across and pointing my knees in the same direction as my heel hook, I force my knees in one direction, and as I pull to the west with my heel hook, my knees point out to the east. You'll notice that my knees and hips come forward. My hips go in the same direction my knees are pointing, and as a result, the braking pressure comes on in a truly intimidating fashion. So we have two contrary forces here, one being applied at the ankle and one being applied at the knee. One is applied with my hips and the other is applied mostly with the head. As my head goes around the corner and straightens my body out, we get one kind of pressure. Now when I add the ashigarami into the balance and lift the heel off the mat, we get a tremendous combination of forces applied throughout the ankle and knee that quickly results in catastrophic damage. We're looking at a general theory of braking mechanics. The first element out of three in this general theory was the idea of contrary or coupled forces. We saw that when it comes time to apply a ripping or tearing force upon ligaments or any other object, opposing forces going in opposite directions are the way to go. Let's look now at the second key element in this general theory of braking, the idea of follow-through. So often I see athletes get to a position where they go up to a break but have no capacity to follow through. The metaphor that we use here is often taken from sports. Picture, for example, a golf club, a ball and a golf swing. If I position a ball on a tee and I take the club and I go to hit with everything I've got as hard as I can, but the very millisecond that I make contact with the ball, I stop the club. I generated tremendous force coming down to the ball. I made contact and then stopped. Physically, that would be impossible to do, but imagine it as a thought experiment. How far would the golf ball go? Not very far at all. What's required in any significant transfer of force is follow through, where once I make contact, I must go through the object upon which I'm applying force and follow through significantly. Only then do we impart sufficient forces upon an object to do something significant. This is true in almost any kind of energy transfer. Think about a punch. If I threw a punch at someone and then stopped it on the surface of their skin, how much power would it generate? Almost nothing. Just as a good puncher punches through his opponent rather than simply stopping on the surface, so too with braking. We can't go up to the point of braking and stop. You have to leave sufficient range of motion to go through an opponent and threaten a severe break. Often I will see people get themselves into situations with heel hooks where they can put pressure on someone, come up to the point of a break, and then they seemingly run out of steam and their opponent scrambles out and the move is lost. It's absolutely critical, regardless of the Ashigarami we work with, that we have a sense of follow through. I can't just expend everything in the first few seconds of contact in the position. I can't just throw my hips in first and then there's nothing else to follow up with. Set the prerequisites first and go in with the hips last, because the hips are going to be the single most important element of your follow through. If I lead with the hips, then when I try to apply to everything else, there's no more hip pressure to go with and there's no follow through as a result. I want to set the conditions of the break first and then finish with a follow through with the hips. So for example, if I make contact with my opponent and I do everything right with the upper body, I haven't even committed my hips yet and my training partner is on the point of tapping. And yet my hips haven't even moved. This is the point right here where my training partner has to tap. I'm just going to release my training partner's legs. He's going to take his heel out. And then from here, you can clearly see that my hips still have significant expansion or extension through the target. This is absolutely critical. Once we lock up on our training partner, if I start with the hips first and then try to catch up with the rest of the heel hook second, there's nothing left to finish with. Set the prerequisites first and finish with the hips. Your opponent should be on the point of tapping long before the hips get engaged. Just subtle movements of my body can create tremendous braking pressure. The hips haven't even been engaged yet. My training partner is ready to tap, and yet I can still go through a significant distance and get the final result we're looking for. Just as I said, a good boxer will always punch through a target, a good heel hooker will heel hook through a knee. We'll come in, lock, we'll find ways to maximize the tension in the leg. So there's the breaking point. I'm just going to release, and yet you can clearly see from here there's still a significant movement through my opponent, which is possible. This must always be your target. Don't be satisfied with getting to the point of a break. Be satisfied only when you've gone long through the point of a break. We're looking at a general theory of braking mechanics. So far we've looked at the idea of coupled forces going in opposing directions. We also saw the idea of following through, that it's never enough just to go up to a point of braking. We have to be able to go through a point of braking if we're going to be taken seriously in the leg locking game. Let's look now at a third element of this general theory of braking, the idea of slack removal. A metaphor which I often use with my students is that of cutting a rope with a knife. If I have a piece of rope hanging from the ceiling and the rope is extremely slack, long and dangling down to the floor, and I ask you to cut that piece of rope with a knife, it's going to take tremendous force on your part. You're going to have to chop with the knife at a tremendous rate of speed in order to get a clean cutting of the rope. But if I take that same rope and I stretch it tight like a piano string with a heavy weight attached down to the floor, even the smallest nick with that same knife will immediately result in the breaking of the rope. So too with the ligaments of the body. Whenever we go into a break, we want to first remove the slack from the ligaments so that the break becomes like an afterthought. So often I see athletes working in a way which is rather inefficient. They have a leg in which there is no tension whatsoever. There's no slack removal. And from here, when they get the grip, they try to explode into breaks. Okay? Their opponent simply straightens out the leg as they do so, and you end up with very, very poor results. What we want to do instead is to remove all of the slack from the joint so that the break, and more importantly the direction of the break, can be completely controlled. The way to do this is when we first make contact with our training partner, we want to put an initial hold that immediately removes slack. The way I like to do this is by changing the position of my forearm relative to my training partner's foot. The more lined up with my lower leg my forearm is, the less effective I'm going to be. So what we use is a reach back, where I take my elbow and bring it back so my forearm is in line with my training partner's foot. The moment I go from here, where there is no slack removal whatsoever, to here, the slack starts to go out of the joint. Once the Ashigarami comes in place, and I put my body over my own hand and my head starts to straighten out, you can see my training partner's response. I haven't even locked my hands yet, and yet he's getting close to the point where he needs to tap. Good people, when they work with heel hooks, can make you go under extreme pressure even as they get the grip. Most people have to lock and then apply full body pressure in a variety of different directions just to get any kind of result. That's not the kind of athlete you want to be. Once I make contact with my training partner, my first action is just right there. The moment my forearm lines up with his foot and we put any form of Ashigarami in place and my head starts to move around the corner, we start to get a breaking pressure. A good way to train yourself to take the slack out of the joint is what we call the one-handed drill. Starting from an outside Ashigarami, I like to have my developing students work their forearm into position and move their head inside the foot. Now, just moving with just the tendons of the forearm, I can get a submission. Your opponent's legs will feel tight like a piano string, and now just with the movement of my fingers alone, I can get breaking pressure. In a situation like this, if I were to lock my hands and drive my hips through, there would be a catastrophic break. Okay? Once again, we can't have a situation where the ligaments are not under stress. The only way to get a break now is through kinetic force, where I have to explode into moves. That's dangerous in the training hall, and it's inconsistent out on the competition mats. What we want is controlled, systematic breaks. So from here, look how the first moment I get underneath my training partner's heel, my first movement is to get my forearm lined up with his foot. Then I use head positioning around the corner that puts him into a position where I can feel he's on the verge of breaking. I know when I'm at that point when merely the movement of my fingers can get submissions. At this point, I feel if I so much as sneezed, I could break my opponent's leg. That simple drill takes the slack out of your training partner's joints and gets you into a position where you can break people at will by design rather than by accident. Let's go on to our next element of braking mechanics. This pertains to the grip that I use to apply the heel hook itself. We've seen that we make a strong distinction between the mechanism of control, which is our ashigarami, and the mechanism of braking, which is, in this case, the heel hook. It's very important you understand the nature and the workings of your hips relative to your hands. Understand this. The true braking pressure from the heel hook comes mostly from the legs and hips. That's where the horsepower of the heel hook comes from. The hands function in a heel hook in a similar way that a transmission functions in an automobile. In an automobile, the horsepower comes from the engine, but that horsepower can only be applied onto the road and generate forward motion when it goes through a transmission to the tires or the wheels. So too with heel hooking. The horsepower comes from my hips and legs, but my ability to apply that horsepower to my opponent's legs comes through my hands and wrists. That's why the grip is so important. Just as it means nothing if you have a 700 horsepower engine rigged up to a faulty transmission, all that horsepower is never going to get to the road, so too it doesn't matter if I have powerful hips and legs if my grip is somehow deficient and I don't transmit the power of those hips and legs efficiently into my opponent's heel. Let's have a look at this notion of gripping and how it influences heel hooking. As you've played in the sport of jiu-jitsu, I'm sure you've noticed there's different degrees of space when I go to grip. If I grip with a 10-finger grip like so, there's a wide circumference made out by my arms. As I close the grip to a palm-to-palm grip, that circumference narrows. As I go to a wrist-to-wrist grip, it narrows further still. And the narrowest is when I get to figure 4 grips. That's why they're so often the favorite method of strangulation, because the gap, that circumference around my arms, has been diminished to the greatest degree possible. So we started wide with a 10-finger, got narrower with palm to palm, narrower still with wrist to wrist, and narrowest of all with figure 4. So too with heel hooking. When I go to grip my opponent, I will often be able to change or vary the amount of braking force that I apply by changing my grip. As a general rule, the smaller the circumference in my arms, the stronger the heel hook. Now, it's not quite as simple as that. There are some variables here based on my elbow position which can change things, but it's not a bad general rule to work with. So very often when I work in any given heel hook situation, you will see myself and my students will often vary their grips depending upon what they're trying to achieve. A good beginning grip for most people to start with is a palm-to-palm grip. If I only had one method of gripping for the rest of my life in heel hooking, I would probably choose a palm-to-palm grip, but you got to know what you're doing with your elbows. The problem with palm-to-palm grips is that they do create a very wide circumference in your arms. So you've got to be very good with your elbow position to maximize their use. This is the easiest grip to get, ultimately the most versatile, but as I said, you've got to know what you're doing with your elbows. So when I grip up with my training partner and I take a palm-to-palm grip, if I just have my elbows in naive positions, there's actually too much space here. And as a result, my opponent can point his toes, slip his heel, and start to move his way out of here. Okay? So it's important that I take my frame arm. Here's my hooking arm. My right hand is my hooking arm. My frame arm wants to come in and put the elbow over the shin bone so that the space between my elbows diminishes. And I get a second force down on the heel to facilitate and work against the lifting force on the heel. So I have a down force on the shin and a lifting force on the heel. Those two contrary forces can create tremendous braking pressure, but I need to know what I'm doing with that elbow. Okay? If my elbow is poorly placed, then we tend to get a singular pull across the chest, which is not so efficient. Okay? If you're unfamiliar with how to use your elbow properly, you may well profit by switching grips to a narrower grip. One of my favorites from here is a wrist-to-wrist grip, where I close the distance and go into a wrist-to-wrist position. Now, when I apply braking force, everything feels very, very tight. I can go further in figure 4, like so, and from here, get an even tighter grip. I can switch to a reverse figure 4 and get a still tighter grip, which will result in tremendous damage. I will often switch grips depending upon the situation in which I find myself. For example, if I have a non-optimal braking position, a rather weak-looking Ashigarami, and my opponent has gone up to his knees, he's no longer broken down to a hip, it may not be sufficient for me to brake with a regular palm-to-palm grip. In these situations, I may well go to a tighter figure 4 grip, which makes for a very strong push and then a pull on the heel for strong braking pressure, even though the Ashigarami situation is less than optimal. By closing the distance and manipulating the distance between my elbows, you can greatly tighten up your hold upon the leg, and you can make your arms work as a very efficient transmitter of the horsepower of your hips into your opponent's legs. Remember, it doesn't matter how strong my hip pressure is if there's some kind of fault in my hand grip. Deficiencies in the hand grip will mean it's very easy for your opponent to slip heels and the force of the hips is completely lost. So we always want to maximize our use of gripping, whether it be wrist to wrist, figure 4 methods, or palm to palm with an elbow locked over the shin. In this way, by utilizing or closing the space between my elbows, the transmission of force into my opponent's legs becomes much more efficient. We've been looking at a general theory of braking mechanics. We've also seen a theory of gripping for braking mechanics, about how as elbow position closes, the transmission of force into our opponent's leg becomes more efficient. It's time now to take the 2 most commonly used heel hook finishes that my athletes use, the inside and the outside heel hook, and look at some broad details of braking mechanics for these 2 incredibly powerful locks. Let's start with the outside heel hook and start to bring in some of the critical details that we'll require in a competition setting based on some of the reflections that we've made so far. I'm going to demonstrate the brake from our favorite braking position. It's not the only braking position, but it's the one we are probably most well known for, which is the outside Ashigarami, both of my feet on the outside of my training partner's legs, usually with locked feet or even a half triangle, like so. I'll leave that up to you. We'll demonstrate from this position, and we'll start to look at how we can apply genuine braking pressure in the kind of competition settings that you'll have to deal with. Probably the most common situation you'll have to deal with is rotation. Your opponents are going to be trying to spin out of the lock, and you should be able to follow their movements through 360 degrees of motion and get to a break. Okay, we've already seen quite a bit with regards braking mechanics. Okay, we've seen that as a general rule, we want to take our training partners the knuckle line of the toes and put it right here in the elbow. We want to make sure that we take our elbow back close to our own torso, and the foot should be pointing across my body. We've seen the idea of a straight body finish, about how I want my head going in the same direction as my training partner's lower leg, out like so that we get a severe folding of the foot. As a result, we get contrary forces where the heel hook is going to the left while the Ashigarami is going to the right. Okay, if we can do all these things in unison, you're going to finish a lot of people with heel hooks. Okay, let's talk about where I want to be, what are our preferred finishing positions, and how things change if we're in less than optimal positions. Okay, as a general rule, I like to finish on my side on my elbow. That's my preferred finishing position. Okay, so I'm not facing my opponent directly here. My body goes in the same direction that my knees are pointing, and I'm propped up on my elbow. Okay, so we lock our training partner up. I've got my elbow in behind me. I bring it in close, and from here, regardless of the grip that I use, I want my knees working against his knee, pushing down like so that we have contrary forces. The ashigarami is going east, the heel hook is going west. And from here, this is a very, very strong breaking position. It starts with the elbow going back, the head moving forward, and then a lift on the heel. And it's that lift on the heel that creates the breaking pressure. So all the slack has been removed through head position. The transmission of forces is efficient because of the grip. And from here, we've got contrary forces. My ashigarami is going out to my right, and my lifting heel hook is going up and over to the left. And as a result, we get a very, very satisfactory result. Now, no matter how good you get at this position, you're going to have opponents who start moving on you. So we should be able to accommodate movement and still get through to a strong break. Let's look at a slightly less than optimal situation where my opponent turns and I find myself having to break from a position flat on my back. I'm no longer in the preferred position. He's come up to a knee and I'm flat on my back. Can I still break from here? Absolutely. Okay. A slight change in tactics. I'm going to switch from cross feet to a senkaku so that it puts all the weight over my training partner's hip. As a result, when he goes to try to continue the turn, there's a huge amount of weight stopping him from turning. I take my hips up off the floor, and from this position, as we lock up, I want to focus on a straightening out of the leg where my body moves out in this direction, like so. So as we lock up, we take all the slack out of the joint, and from here, I lift out to the side. I don't go in the same direction as his turn. That's not optimal. I want to stop his turn across my body. So my senkaku plants down to the floor. When he goes to turn in this direction, the senkaku provides tremendous resistance. The only way to get true breaking pressure here is to get your hips off the mat. So as he goes to move, look how I lift my pelvis off the floor. That puts weight down on my opponent and ensures that the straightening of my body creates a very, very strong break. What if I'm a little slow? What if my opponent does successfully turn? Well, in those situations, we'll go to a belly down finish. From the belly down position, I lock wrist to wrist and I drive forward towards the floor. This will force my opponent into a last ditch finish, which is to spin across and try and complete the roll. And that puts us right back into our favorite breaking position on a single elbow and hip, and from here we get the same pressure that we saw earlier. Essentially what we had there is a series of breaks that occurred over 360 degrees of resisting motion. That's exactly what you must have as someone who's ultimately looking to become a master of heel hooks. You have to be able to break through a 360 degrees of resisting motion. At any given moment, you should be able to hit a successful break. Let's have a look at this again. Yes, it's true. There is a preferred breaking position. Why is it preferred? Because it's the single easiest way for me to line my body up and then from here exert force on my opponent's leg by lifting my heels off the mat and then a strong lifting force. Your opponents know that, and so they will often go to turn. When we see that, we lock a senkaku and bring our hips off the floor. Once we lock in this position, the breaking pressure is deeply impressive. If I should prove to be a little too slow to get that, I will lock and we will break here in the upside down position. This will force my opponent into a final roll, which takes us right back into our preferred breaking position, the one we started in, and now we're ready to break all over again. Following my opponent in this way through multiple breaks in multiple different positions is the goal that you want to work towards. Let's look now at breaking mechanics for the inside heel hook. Whenever we have very powerful opponents who are skilled in leg lock defense, as a general rule, we favor inside heel hooks over outside heel hooks. The reason for this is easy to explain. When we go into any form of outside heel hook, most of the damage goes in a curve on the outside of your training partner's ankle up through the outside of the knee, in particular the LCL ligament. Damage to the LCL is certainly considerable, but of all the knee ligaments, it's the one which is affected the least by damage in some kind of heel hook context. An LCL can be torn quite severely and still recover without the need for surgical intervention. We often find that opponents can continue to fight even after an LCL has been quite severely torn or sprained. In the case of an inside heel hook, almost all the damage gets applied to the MCL and to a lesser degree the ACL. Damage to the MCL tends to be much more damaging to my opponent's athleticism. In addition, it tends to be felt much more by the athlete as the move is being enacted, and as a result it tends to have a higher finishing percentage when you're in a very competitive situation. Let's have a look at breaking mechanics for the inside heel hook. Different elements which stand a little bit in contrast to the outside heel hook situation. First, some things don't change. When we go in here, one of the main problems we face is heel slippage. Once again, if my forearm lines up with my opponent's lower leg, it's easier for him to point his toes and slip his heel inside. So one of the habits we always want to get into is that of taking our forearm in line with our training partner's foot, not the lower leg. Once we get into a situation like this, one of our favorite ways to act is to come up to a single shoulder finish. I'm going to drive my hips forward and bring a single shoulder down towards the mat so that my hips come well up off the floor. As a result, from this kind of situation, I can lock a full Senkaku underneath my training partner's legs. This puts tremendous weight over my opponent's leg. And now, as the hips come forward and the elbow goes back, we get a fantastic amount of breaking pressure. Even drilling this is deeply uncomfortable for your training partner. I apologize. You can see what happens as I drive my body weight forward. I prevent his foot from moving by putting my shoulder down to the mat. As my shoulder essentially pins my opponent's foot to the floor, the hips take over. Now as the hips follow, even with no hands, you can see there's tremendous breaking pressure. So essentially the breaking mechanic on a single shoulder finish is always pin the foot and follow with the hips. So we lock. I'm going to demonstrate with one hand so that I don't hurt my training partner. I put my shoulder to the mat, my hips come off the floor, so there's body weight over the leg. I won't lock a triangle because that would be too severe on my training partner. As my hips go forward, we get a very severe break indeed. This would be a single shoulder finish. This stands in contrast to another form of finish which I also greatly favor, a flat back finish. In a flat back finish, as always, we line everything up with the foot, but instead of going to a single shoulder, we go to two shoulders. When we lock up in this position, I take both shoulders back towards the mat, so my back is flat on the floor. Then from here, my 2 feet pressure downwards, usually in a Senkaku position. Then I take my right elbow and I push it towards my training partner's crotch. As a result, you get exemplary breaking pressure. Once again, a flat back finish. We get our forearm lined up with our training partner. We resist the temptation to bring the hooking hand forwards. People so often go to lock their hands by bringing the hook hand forwards. No, we always bring the support hand to the hook hand so that our wrist stays in the optimal breaking position. Now I roll my 2 shoulders back towards the floor, lock my Senkaku, and I drive my hips up, my feet down, and I drive my elbow towards his crotch. Your opponent's defensive reaction is to come up off the floor. He has to do it or the leg will break if he stays down on his butt. Once we get to this position, we lock the Senkaku, everything back, I straighten my body out, and we go back pointing the elbow at the crotch, and it's a very, very powerful finish indeed. A third very useful breaking position occurs in situations where either my opponent steps over in this direction as a means of rotating out of the lock. That's one way it could happen. Or it might happen because I willingly tilt my training partner over. However it happens, we've tilted our opponent over in this direction. Now he's inverted, but I'm still facing the ceiling just like so. In these situations, I point myself onto my outside shoulder. From an outside single shoulder finish, I take my 2 feet and pressure them into the side of his body and bring my pelvis off the mat. Now I point my elbow directly at my training partner's hips. And from here, we get extreme amounts of breaking pressure. Just as we did with the outside heel hook, we're looking at the idea of breaking our opponent through a huge amount of rotation. That's something we must become skilled at. You never know which way your opponent is going to move in the middle of a leg lock confrontation. You must be able to break in more than one position and get powerful breaking mechanics in all of them. So once again, we start off with a single shoulder finish. From here, we pin the foot, utilizing the shoulder, and drive our pelvis forward into the lock. Then we saw the idea of a flat back finish, where I lock a Senkaku, and from here, straighten my body out, point my elbow, my training partner's crotch, for a strong finish. If he steps over my body, we go to an outside single shoulder finish. I lift my hips off the floor, elbow points at his hips, and again, we get a fantastically strong break.